I want to talk about herd immunity briefly because it's a very important concept and something upon which vaccine mandates are largely dependent. The perceived need to maintain a level of immunity in the population using vaccination to prevent exposure of those who, for example, can't be vaccinated. They're too young or they've got some immune compromise due to cancer chemotherapy or steroids or something like this. And it's a very important thing to understand and to be able to articulate in a way that one can debate with those who maintain that herd immunity is the sort of central tenet of why we should mandate vaccines for children. What I want to do is separate it out into natural herd immunity that occurred before the vaccine era and then herd immunity or the perception of herd immunity in the vaccine era. Now, firstly, natural herd immunity did not act to prevent infection. What it did was act to prevent infection in those at highest risk of complications. For example, the very young. And we'll just go into how vaccination has changed that. And let's use measles. We'll look at several viruses, but let's use measles as an example. Firstly, herd immunity, natural herd immunity, protection against serious morbidity and mortality, death from infection, was declining dramatically from measles long before the vaccine ever came in. So herd immunity was changing over time. It was improving to the extent that beyond 1920 in the UK and the US, there was a dramatic fall in case fatality rate, in the death from infection, by 99.6% before the vaccine ever came in. Now the question would be is what would have happened if we'd never vaccinated? If you'd followed the natural trend of that curve, it was approaching zero. Would it have gone to zero in the absence of vaccination? And the answer is very likely yes. That was the natural trend. Of course, we'll never know because we intervened with vaccination. The question is why? Why was case fatality rate and morbidity, the seriousness of the infection itself and its complications, falling so dramatically? And this is down to pattern of exposure. These are socioeconomic circumstances. So one of the risks of serious adverse outcome from measles is the intensity of the exposure, the amount of virus that you get. And as family sizes decreased, slum dwellings decreased, children sharing beds and bedrooms declined, the intensity of exposure dropped. And over time, not only did the intensity of exposure drop, but nutritional status improved. So vitamins such as C, as D and A improved, and all of these helped immune defenses. So what we were seeing was a decline, a natural decline in the seriousness of the infection long in advance of vaccines coming in. And that was an example of natural herd immunity. It was operating to protect babies. And the other part of natural herd immunity was maternal immunity, passive immunity from the mother. The mother exposed to measles herself as a child develops lifelong immunity, and then when she's pregnant, she gives antibodies transplacentally and in breast milk postpartum to her baby that protect him or her through the first year of life. That is natural herd immunity, an example of it. Because the baby is at greatest risk of an adverse reaction to measles in the first year of life, intuitively, because their immune system is not adequately developed, at least in part. So that natural herd immunity from the mother protected the infant during that susceptible period. Now, what has happened in the face of vaccination is that natural herd immunity has been destroyed. What we now have is mothers being vaccinated as children, not contracting natural measles, giving very, very poor passive immunity to their babies, and that baby then being susceptible to measles in the first year of life. So we have destroyed that part of natural herd immunity as an unintended and unexpected consequence of vaccination. Now, you could argue that if measles were to come back, precisely because of the effects of vaccination, we would have a lot of babies who are susceptible to measles and problems with that infection. And this is a problem that can be ascribed to the vaccine program itself. Another example is mumps. Let's take mumps. The mumps vaccine does not work. So what we're seeing is outbreaks of mumps around the world in populations that have received 2, 3, 4 doses of the mumps vaccine. The mumps vaccine does not work, and why it doesn't work is another issue that we can go into, and how Merck acted to cover that up is an issue of current interest. But we don't need to go into that for the moment. Mumps was historically contracted at around the age of 5 to 7 by children who then develop lifelong immunity. Mumps in children is a trivial disease. It's acknowledged to be a trivial disease. And indeed, the CDC and the Department of Health in the UK determined there was no need for a mumps vaccine because it was so mild and its complications were not serious. But nonetheless, for commercial reasons, I believe a mumps vaccine was foisted onto the population and has been made mandatory for many. Now, because the vaccine does not work in enough people or for long enough, then what we see is the re-emergence of mumps in older populations, in teenagers and college students. And the problems arise because mumps is a much more serious disease in, for example, post-pubertal males, where they can develop testicular inflammation, orchitis, and sterility. So a mumps vaccine that doesn't work is not only a useless vaccine, it's a dangerous vaccine because it destroys natural herd immunity, that is the exposure of individuals when the disease is mild, and displaces it up to a susceptibility to disease at a time when the disease is severe or more severe. So not only have we destroyed natural herd immunity to mumps with vaccination, we have made mumps a much more dangerous disease than it was historically. The other example, looking at live viral vaccines, is chickenpox. There was a disease, a rite of passage, a trivial disease for so many children, where it was decided that initially, to keep mother in the workplace, ergo for economic reasons, that there should be a chickenpox vaccine. That wasn't very good propaganda, so it became more serious than we thought. Suddenly it changed the messaging around the chickenpox vaccine. But what happened with chickenpox is a DNA virus that's able to persist in the body and come back as shingles, a very severe and unpleasant condition, typically seen in those who are immunocompromised or elderly patients. Shingles was extremely rare in children and those who were otherwise healthy. Now, what happened is the immune system was regularly boosted against chickenpox by exposure to children and grandchildren who had natural chickenpox. So not only had you contracted it as a child, but then you had this intermittent wild-type boosting, it's called, due to exposure to your children and grandchildren. And that kept the immune system boosted and the virus under control. And what happened when vaccination came in is that natural pattern of chickenpox epidemics disappeared. The immune system was no longer boosted. The immunity to chickenpox waned in individuals, and the virus woke up again, and it caused shingles. So we now face an epidemic of shingles, not just in people who are immunocompromised or the elderly, but across all age spectra. And that's very, very disturbing because it's a very, very unpleasant condition. And that, again, is an unintended consequence of vaccination, which is operated to destroy natural herd immunity. And the response of that by the companies, by the manufacturers, is, wow, we've created another market, we've created another epidemic, so let's make a vaccine against it. So they took the chickenpox vaccine, multiplied it 10 times the dose, and turned it into what was called a Zostavax or shingles vaccine. And so they will look at every cloud as having a silver lining, clouds which they themselves have created. But there you have just 3 examples of how natural herd immunity operated in the pre-vaccine era and has been destroyed by the process of vaccination. And finally, as just a sort of side note, we are told that you require 95% immunity within a population conferred by the vaccine to protect against the resurgence of an infection like measles. That must be nonsense, because they're talking about children. But we know these vaccines wane over time, and so perhaps 96% of the population are not immune to these infections. What about all the adults who are not immune to these infections because they had their vaccines years ago, they'd never had boosters, and now their immunity's gone away? So this whole concept of herd immunity, which relies upon the children, 95% of the children being vaccinated, does not take account of the many, many millions of adults who are no longer immune, who are nonetheless, by their criteria, capable of contracting and transmitting these infectious diseases. Does it happen? No. So the very foundation of mandatory vaccine laws, in other words, the need to protect the unprotected by virtue of a mass vaccination uptake, is so deeply flawed on many reasons. But the anxiety for me, as much as anything, is that we have destroyed natural herd immunity. And have we created populations that are now in some way dependent upon these flawed, deeply flawed vaccines and vaccine policies? And what happens now when a virus escapes the immunity conferred by the vaccine, or a bacteria, such as pertussis, which we're seeing? So now pertussis has escaped, in many, the immunity conferred by the pertussis vaccine. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so you create these mutants that then become the dominant strain for which we have no immunity. What happens when the superbug comes along, as it has done with antibiotics and bacteria, and we no longer have an answer for it? So we are creating, I believe, an invidious position for future generations in dealing with infectious disease by virtue of not having thought through this issue very, very carefully and learned from our experience with antibiotics before embarking on what is a very hazardous vaccine program, I believe.